As the September deadline looms, calls for the government to detail how they hope to manage a soft landing are growing louder. Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute joined me. Richard Dennis, welcome to The Business.
Thank you.
Richard, we've had groups like ACOS to the Business Council who had been calling for a lift to what is now known as JobSeeker, even before COVID-19 hit. What happens if the government ignores those calls in September and pulls that funding back?
Look, I mean, Australia's support for unemployment benefits has been terribly low for a terribly long time. It was Paul Keating that last gave the unemployed a real pay rise, and by international standards, our unemployment benefit is very, very low. So it was great to see the government finally listen to such broad demands to increase it at the beginning of this crisis. But to go back to where we were would be both unfair and economically reckless. I mean, let's be clear, the economy is not going to be in full flight in the second half of this year. Unemployment's still going to be very high. So the idea that the unemployment benefit doesn't really matter because people won't be on it for very long is ridiculous. They're going to be on it for a long time. But also, unemployment benefits are a form of fiscal stimulus that's targeted right into the regions that have the most unemployed. So apart from being unfair and very, very inequitable to have such low unemployment benefits, if we return to anything like the old levels, we're actually going to be introducing contractionary fiscal policy. We'll be cutting spending on the regions with the most unemployed people in them.
The OECD says that the world economy is in the worst recession it's seen since the Great Depression. It also says that Australia should keep its JobKeeper payments. What do you think should happen to that payment?
Look, I mean, the idea that we're just going to cut off JobKeeper after it's been in place for 6 months is, well, it's absurd. I mean, remember that when JobKeeper was announced, the government was talking about how the economy was about to snap back. We were going to have the economy snapping back, we were going to go into a short hibernation and then everything would be okay. Well, the Prime Minister hasn't uttered the word snap back for months. No one thinks the economy is going to snap back. So the idea that because we set this 6-month timetable back in February, we have to stick to it makes no economic sense. I don't even think it makes political sense. I mean, let's be clear, millions of Australians are going to be affected directly or indirectly if the government cuts JobKeeper just because it gets to that 6-month timetable. The economy is going to be suppressed for years to come. Unemployment's going to be above average for years to come. The government might want to tinker with JobKeeper. There might be some groups that don't need it anymore. There might be some companies that don't need it anymore. But there's going to be huge parts of the economy are going to need continued support.
Women have been particularly hard hit in this crisis. Could the government have created stimulus or directed its stimulus to better benefit that part of our community?
Oh, it could have, and it still can. So women are massively overrepresented in the casual workforce, and unfortunately that means they've been massively overrepresented in bearing the brunt of this economic crisis. So while women have been disproportionately impacted, the design of JobKeeper has actually been, quite exclusionary of casuals and in turn, therefore, disproportionately of women. So women got hit hardest by the recession. They've been disproportionately excluded from the JobKeeper program. And then, of course, you've got the government that, whether it's for the optics or the actual belief, but wearing hard hats and high vis whenever they talk about jobs, the reality is hundreds of thousands of women have lost their jobs in retail, in tourism, in hospitality, in entertainment. Those women are not going to get jobs because of any boost to construction spending. Of course, construction stimulus has a part to play in the recovery, but we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to talk about the shape of the stimulus as much as the size, and we need to be aiming money at the sectors that employ lots and lots of people, and that's the services sector where women dominate.
The stimulus has clearly helped the economy insofar as we've even seen a lift in equity markets. People are putting their money into the stock market. What do you think would happen to that growth we've seen in that sector if we do indeed have a cliff in a couple of months' time?
Look, yeah, I'll leave it for others to say where the stock market will end up, but it does seem as a macroeconomist like there's a bit of irrational exuberance in there. And yes, you're right, there's absolutely no doubt the government is pumping a lot of money into the economy at the moment, as it should. And as private sector activity is falling, as private consumer demand is falling, it makes perfect sense for the government to increase its spending and to increase public sector demand. But to think that we get to the September quarter and that won't be needed anymore, it's bizarre. The economy will still be struggling in the second half of this year. No one thinks it won't. And if the government is going to cut spending in the September quarter, then obviously that's going to lead to a reduction in the size of the economy and an increase in the amount of unemployment. That's got to be bad news for companies that are trying to sell products to Australian consumers, which is most of them.
House prices have been falling in this environment, and we've seen the amount of properties on the market significantly reduced. We haven't got any international movement coming in, which is obviously helps that sector as well. Do you see big falls in housing if there is no extension to any of this stimulus?
Look, I think house prices are far more likely to fall than rise. I don't see anyone suggesting they're about to surge. Australia has a very high rate of immigration. We've had high rates of population growth. That's been driving up housing prices for decades. And obviously now we're going into the lowest rate of immigration that we've had in modern history. So the number of people moving to Australia, the number of people needing housing is going to be far below the trends that we use to justify the investment that's already in the pipeline. That investment pipeline is quite long. It takes a long time to start and finish a project. So we've still got new developments coming into the market. We've got less people coming into Australia, particularly for units and houses in outer suburban areas. You'd have to expect to see significant house price falls. Whether that keeps falling or whether it spreads across the whole market, only time will tell. But again, JobKeeper is increasing the ability for people to pay their rent, and the ability for people to pay their rent is what keeps their landlords from having to sell their houses. We could see all sorts of problems if unemployment continues to rise and a lot of investment property owners become distressed sellers. If investment owners have to sell their houses in a hurry, we're going to see even bigger falls in the house price.
In some ways, Australians are all in this together. Of course, not everyone has been impacted by job losses or reduced hours, but we know a big portion of the community has. Has the overall community changed its behaviour to counteract that domino effect of big job losses? Are we seeing a community approach?
Look, I think we've seen elements of that. I think there's no doubt that there's a lot of individual and community activity around supporting other people. There's no doubt that some employers have gone out of their way to support their staff and to support their customers. But ultimately, in an economy, if people don't have money in their pocket, they can't spend it. And if people aren't spending their money, then someone else isn't earning it. And I think there is a lot of goodwill out there at the moment. People understand it's an unprecedented health crisis and people are trying to pull together. But I think the government needs to capture that spirit, and rather than turn its back on the unemployed and cut JobSeeker or turn their back on industries that are struggling and say, well, that's enough for JobKeeper, I think the government needs to embrace that same approach and say, look, this is a once-in-a-century event. If we all pull together, we can actually soften the pain for everybody. I think there's a huge community appetite for that, but I see the government. It's been talking Keynesian for a couple of months, but I don't think it's thinking very Keynesian at the moment. I think it's planning to go back to cutting spending and trying to control debts and deficits. That's a very dangerous way to manage a recession.
Richard Dennis, good to talk to you.